I was in the student commons on the third floor of the business school building, sitting at a corner table with a lukewarm coffee and my economics textbook open to a chapter I'd already read 4 times. It was 11:20 in the morning. I know that because I'd been watching the clock, calculating whether I had time to grab food before my 12 o'clock seminar. I was hungry. I was always hungry that semester. The meal plan my parents could afford covered 2 meals a day, and I'd learned to stretch the math. That was when Bradley Monroe walked in. He didn't just walk. Bradley Monroe never just did anything. He moved through a room the way certain people do when they've been told their whole lives that rooms exist to receive them. 3 people flanked him. I recognized 2 of them from our shared corporate finance seminar, the kind of guys who laughed at Bradley's jokes half a second before the punchline landed, preloaded for approval. He was wearing a jacket that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His hair was effortlessly arranged in that way that takes significant effort to appear effortless. He was 20 years old and already carried himself like a man who chaired meetings. I would have ignored him. I was good at ignoring Bradley Monroe. I had been practicing it since the first week of the semester when he'd made a comment during orientation, something about scholarship kids cluttering up the curve, that landed in the room like a grenade no one officially acknowledged. I'd absorbed it, filed it, moved on. That was what I did. That was what I'd always done. But that morning, he spotted me. I don't know why he chose that particular Tuesday to stop. Maybe he was bored. Maybe he'd had a bad night. Maybe he was performing for his entourage, and I was the nearest available prop. He crossed the commons with a smile already in place, and dropped into the chair across from me without being invited. His 2 flankers positioned themselves behind him like parentheses. "Still grinding?" he said, nodding at the textbook. I looked up slowly. I didn't say anything. "You know you could just buy the summaries online," he said. "Save yourself the eye strain." He glanced at my coffee, although maybe buying anything is a stretch right now. One of the guys behind him made a sound, not quite a laugh, more like an acknowledgement that something had been said. I closed the textbook, not dramatically, quietly. "Is there something you need, Bradley?" "Nothing," he said, leaning back in the chair, completely relaxed. "Just being friendly. We're classmates, right? Same cohort, same future." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, a calculation moving behind his eyes. "Well, different futures, obviously." "Obviously," I said. He tilted his head. "You know my father does business with your father, right? I've heard about your family." Another pause, longer this time. "I've heard the numbers." My stomach dropped. I kept my face still. "Here's the thing," Bradley said, and his voice got quieter, which was worse. "When people like him get quieter, it means they've moved from performance to precision. I don't have anything against you personally. I actually think it's admirable what you're trying to do here. First-generation strivers, working the angles, hoping the degree opens a door." He leaned forward slightly. "But the door is only as valuable as who's waiting on the other side, and no one's waiting for you. You don't have the name, you don't have the network, you don't have the capital. You have a textbook you've read 4 times. He glanced at my book. "And a coffee that's been cold for 20 minutes. That's not a future. That's a very expensive bus stop." He stood up, straightened his jacket. The smile came back, reflexive and clean. "Keep grinding," he said. "It's good for character." He walked away. His entourage followed. The commons went on around me. Conversations, laptop keys, someone's phone, playing music through one earbud, completely indifferent to the fact that a piece of me had just been surgically extracted and placed on the table in front of me. I sat there for a long time. I didn't go to my 12 o'clock seminar. I want you to understand something before I go further, because this story is going to ask a lot of you. It's going to ask you to stay with me through years of slow, unglamorous, grinding work, and you deserve to know up front that it was worth it. 14 months after that conversation in the student commons, I would sit in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of Monroe Industries headquarters. I would sit at the head of the table, I would place a folder on the glass surface in front of me, a folder I had spent 11 months building, page by careful page, and I would watch Bradley Monroe's father's face go gray. Not red, not angry, gray. The color of a man who has just understood, all at once, the full dimensions of what is happening to him. Bradley would be in the room. I would not look at him until the very end. When I finally did, he would not look back. I'm getting ahead of myself, but I needed you to know, because what comes next is hard, and you're going to need a reason to stay. Let me tell you about my family, quickly, because it matters. My father, Frank, was a second-generation small business owner who ran a mid-sized logistics and warehousing company that had done reasonably well in the 90s and early 2000s, and then spent the following decade in a slow, grinding decline that he refused to acknowledge and everyone around him could see. He was not a bad man. He was proud, which is different. He had a version of himself that he maintained like a property he couldn't afford to renovate, but couldn't bring himself to sell. In that version, the company was temporary trouble. The family name carried weight. Appearances mattered enormously. My mother, Catherine, had made a secondary career out of managing those appearances. She worked part-time in medical billing and full-time in the social architecture of making their life look better than it was. She was not cruel, but she was frightened, and frightened people will do things to the people they love that look a lot like cruelty from the outside. My older brother Anthony was 2 years ahead of me and had already determined that the fastest path to security was proximity to money he hadn't earned. He was charming, which he wielded with the precision of a scalpel, and he had a relationship with honesty that could charitably be called flexible. Anthony had a way of standing slightly too close to opportunities that weren't his, and making them appear through sheer force of social gravity to drift toward him. Then there was my grandfather, Martin. Martin Keller was my mother's father, and he had been absent from our lives for as long as I could remember in any meaningful way. There were birthday cards when I was young, always with cash inside, never checks, always cash, and occasional phone calls that my mother received in the kitchen with the door closed. By the time I was a teenager, even the calls had stopped. He had become a fact about our family rather than a presence in it. My father referred to him, when he referred to him at all, with a particular tone, not quite contempt, not quite envy, that I had never been able to fully decode. What I knew about Martin Keller, he had started with nothing, literally nothing. He'd grown up the son of a factory worker, dropped out of school at 16, worked construction, saved money with a discipline that his contemporaries apparently found alarming, and then made a series of investments in the 70s and 80s that compounded quietly and steadily into something significant. He never appeared in financial press. He had no social media presence, obviously. He was 78 years old. He lived in a large house outside the city, and by all accounts, lived simply. He was, in the language my father used, eccentric, meaning he had not shared his money with us, and this was irrational behavior that required a diagnostic label. I had met him perhaps 6 times in my life. The last time was when I was 15. He had taken me to lunch, just me, not Anthony, which caused a week of tension at home, and he had asked me questions with the focused attention of someone conducting an interview. Not about my grades, not about my future plans, about what I noticed, about how I thought. He'd asked me once, over a plate of food I'd been too nervous to eat, when you walk into a room full of people, what's the first thing you look for? I'd thought about it. The exits, I'd said finally, and whoever's pretending not to be watching. He'd smiled, just once, quick, like a door opening and closing. I didn't know, at 15, what that lunch meant. I wouldn't understand it for years. The pressure at home around my grades was a specific suffocating kind. It wasn't about learning, it was about signal, about maintaining the appearance that the family was producing people of distinction. My father needed me to be excellent in ways that would reflect on him. When I got a B+ on an economics midterm in my second semester, he called it disappointing, with the same voice he used for genuine disasters. When I explained the curve and the fact that the class average was a C, he said, "I'm not interested in averages. I'm interested in what people say about you." This is the context in which Bradley Monroe's comments landed. They landed in soil that had been tilled for years, ready to receive exactly that seed. I had been told in various registers by the most important people in my life that I was not enough, not impressive enough, not connected enough, not strategic enough, not the right kind. When Bradley Monroe sat across from me in that commons and said, with clinical pleasantness, that no one was waiting for me on the other side of any door, he wasn't introducing a new idea. He was confirming one I'd been living with since childhood. That's what made it so devastating, not the novelty, the confirmation. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late October, 6 weeks after the Commons incident. I was in my dorm room, a single, barely large enough to turn around in, which I'd gotten through a housing lottery and which I guarded like a necessary solitude. I was working on a financial modeling assignment. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. "Is this Martin Keller's grandson?" The voice was formal, measured, a lawyer's voice. "Yes," I said. "My name is Howard Pierce. I'm the managing attorney for your grandfather's estate. I'm calling to inform you that Martin Keller passed away on Tuesday evening. He had a cardiac event at home. It was peaceful." A pause. "I'm sorry for your loss." I sat with this for a moment. I didn't know what I felt. Something complicated. Grief for something I'd never quite had. Guilt that the grief wasn't sharper. Confusion about why a lawyer was calling me instead of my mother. "Why are you calling me directly?" I asked. "Because," Howard Pierce said, "Mr. Keller's instructions specified that you be notified first, before other family members." He was explicit about the sequence. Another pause. "There will be a reading of the will in our offices next Friday. Your attendance is mandatory. That's Mr. Keller's language, not mine. I would strongly encourage you to be there." I said I would be. After I hung up, I sat for a long time in the small room, with its institutional furniture and its single window that looked out on a parking structure. I thought about a lunch I'd had at 15, and a question about exits and watchers. I thought about cash and birthday cards. I thought about a door opening and closing in a face. The reading of the will was in Howard Pierce's offices downtown, a quiet, expensive floor in a building that smelled like leather and old paper, and the specific kind of silence that money maintains. My mother and father were already there when I arrived. Anthony was there too, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, doing the thing he did where he made stillness look like strategic patience. The family of my grandfather's one-time business partner was not there, which I noted. I filed it. Howard Pierce was compact, precise, silver-haired. He had the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered difficult documents to difficult people for 30 years and had no remaining emotional stake in the outcomes. He waited until everyone was seated, arranged his papers with small, exact movements, and began. The assets were considerable. The house, a significant property I had never seen, somewhere outside the city. Investment accounts, portfolio holdings across several sectors. A collection of what Pierce described as controlling interests in multiple private ventures. The total, when he named it, produced a sound from Anthony that he converted, imperfectly, into a cough. Then Pierce said, "All of the above, in their entirety, are bequeathed to," and he said my name, "the sole heir and beneficiary." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. My father said, "I'm sorry, what?" My mother's hand went to her mouth. Anthony turned from the window slowly and his face went through 4 or 5 things in rapid succession before settling on something controlled and unreadable. Pierce continued, undisturbed. The bequest is unconditional with respect to distribution, meaning no portion is allocated to any other family member, including the testator's daughter or her husband or any other descendants. He looked up briefly. However, there is one condition of inheritance. He read it from the document. The condition was this: before taking formal control of the estate, the heir must withdraw from his current academic program. Not permanently. The language specified temporary withdrawal, with the option to return, and he must accept and fulfill a 12-month term of employment as a maintenance worker, a janitor at Monroe Industries, the corporation headquartered downtown. The heir could not reveal his identity to anyone at the company during this period. At the conclusion of the 12 months, with documented proof of completed employment, full control of the estate would transfer. If the condition was not accepted within 30 days, the estate would be liquidated, and the proceeds donated to a list of charitable organizations that Pierce began reading before my father stood up. "Stop," my father said. He wasn't shouting. He was doing something more controlled than shouting. "Stop. This has to be legally challengeable. This is clearly—" "The document is valid in all jurisdictions," Pierce said. "I can give you the contact information for our firm's litigation division if you'd like an independent assessment. But I should tell you we've already had the document reviewed by 2 external counsel, and the language is—" "He was mentally incompetent," Anthony said. "It came out smooth, calculated. At his age, clearly, Mr. Keller underwent a formal cognitive assessment 8 months ago, at his own request," Pierce said. "The results are part of the estate documents. He was assessed as fully competent." He looked at Anthony for a moment. He specifically anticipated challenges on that basis. The room was very loud for a long time. My mother was crying in a quiet, careful way. Not for grief, I realized. For something else. For the gap between the life she'd been secretly counting on and the life that was now presenting itself. My father paced. Anthony stood very still and said very little, which was when Anthony was most dangerous. At some point, they all looked at me. I hadn't said anything. I'd been sitting in my chair, hands folded on the table, watching, thinking about exits, watching who was pretending not to watch. "Well," my father said, "you understand this is insane. You understand what this means. Dropping out, working as a janitor in that building in front of everyone." "I understand what it means," I said. "Then you understand you can't do it." "I understand what it means," I repeated. I didn't say I wasn't going to do it. Another silence, different from the last one. "You can't be serious," Anthony said. I looked at him. He met my eyes for exactly 1 second before looking away. That was interesting. Anthony almost never looked away first. "I'll need the employment contact," I said to Howard Pierce, "and the address of the property. What do you think? If you'd been in that room, would you have accepted the condition? Drop it in the comments." I read everyone. I drove to the Monroe Industries building on a Monday morning in November, and I wore the uniform they gave me, and I held everything I was feeling somewhere very deep and still inside me where no one could see it. The uniform was dark gray, a custodial polo with the company logo on the chest and pants with reinforced knees, practical, anonymous, the kind of thing that renders you functionally invisible in a corporate environment, because people in offices have a particular talent for not seeing the people who maintain the spaces they occupy. My supervisor was a barrel-chested, methodical man I'll call the maintenance chief. He had been doing this job for 19 years, and he had zero interest in my life story or my feelings about the work. He showed me the equipment, the schedules, the protocols. He explained what clean meant in a building like this. Not just swept and mopped, but the particular invisible clean of glass elevator buttons wiped down every hour, of conference rooms reset exactly as they'd been, of bathrooms that erased all evidence of human use with the thoroughness of a crime scene. Cleanup. He was not unkind. He was simply someone who expected the work to be done correctly and was not interested in complications. I told him my name. He wrote it on a schedule. That was the entirety of my hiring process. I worked the evening shift, 5 p.m. to 2 a.m., Monday through Friday, with weekend rotations on the 6th and 7th floors, which were executive territory and therefore required additional clearing protocols. I was assigned the lobby, the atrium, the service corridors, and the elevator banks. Later, as I proved reliable, I would get the conference rooms on floors 12 through 18. The first night, I mopped the lobby floor. Marble, large format tiles, sealed with something that required a specific product applied in a specific dilution, or it would leave film. I had never mopped a marble floor in my life. I did it wrong the first time and had to do it again. The maintenance chief came through at midnight, crouched, examined the surface under a tilted flashlight. Again, he said. I did it again. Better, he said, and moved on. At 2 a.m., I drove back to the apartment I was now renting, a small, spare place across town, close to nothing convenient, chosen because it was what the budget allowed while the estate transfer was in process. I ate something simple and sat for a while in the quiet, and then I slept for 5 hours before getting up and doing whatever the next day required. This was my life now. My phone had a contact from my mother. 17 missed calls in the first week, then fewer, then occasional bursts. Anthony texted me once, a single line that said, "This is a mistake you'll regret," and then went silent in a way that, I would later understand, meant he was doing something. My father didn't contact me at all, which was its own specific communication. I had deactivated my university email. I had quietly arranged through the registrar a formal leave of absence rather than a withdrawal. I had read the grandfather's language carefully. It said, "withdraw from his current academic program," but Howard Pierce, when I asked him privately, confirmed that a leave of absence satisfied the condition. It was the first time I had found ambiguity in the document and used it. It would not be the last. Let me tell you something about the first 60 days, because I want to be honest about what it actually was, as opposed to what it sounds like in summary. It was exhausting in a way that went beyond the physical. The physical exhaustion was real. I had not spent my life doing manual labor, and mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms and moving equipment for 9 hours a night has a way of educating your body about its actual capacity very quickly. My feet hurt every day for the first 3 weeks. My lower back developed a specific, constant ache that the ibuprofen I took before each shift could only partially address. I learned to move differently, from the hips, not the shoulders, transferring weight economically, the way people who have been doing physical work their whole lives learn to move. But the deeper exhaustion was the cognitive one. Not because the work was intellectually demanding, it wasn't, not most of it, but because I was simultaneously doing the work and watching the building, taking in information, processing patterns, holding everything together in a mental architecture that I was building from nothing, in a domain I had no training for. The maintenance chief expected the work to be done to a specific standard. The observation I was conducting required a separate, parallel level of attention. Running both simultaneously for 9 hours, 5 nights a week, is the kind of thing that takes a toll that doesn't announce itself until you sit down and suddenly realize you can't quite remember how you got home. I also had to manage my posture within the social environment of the maintenance crew. There were 6 of us on the evening shift, the chief, 3 long-term staff, 1 other relatively new hire, and me. They were, collectively, decent people doing a job that most people treated as invisible, which had made some of them hardened in a specific way, not cruel, just protective. They had seen new hires come through who were contemptuous or who used the position as a temporary embarrassment before something better came along, and they had learned to recognize that type quickly. I had to not be that type. Not as a performance. Performed humility is always detectable, And these were people who had spent years in the margins of powerful institutions, developing excellent detectors for inauthenticity. I had to simply do the work, show up, do it right, ask questions when I didn't know something, not offer opinions about how things might be done differently or better, not signal in any way that I thought I was there temporarily. The genuine version of this was easier than I expected, because I needed them. I needed the access that being a trusted, unremarkable part of the crew provided. I needed the routines, the floor assignments, the keycard clearances that came with demonstrated reliability. Every act of genuine competence at the actual job served the larger purpose. The work was its own reward in that specific, instrumental sense. By week 6, the maintenance chief had given me the conference room assignments on 12 through 18. By week 8, I had weekend access to the executive floor bathroom facilities during cleaning rotations. By week 10, I was trusted to work alone on certain floors during the late overnight window. That trust was the most important thing I built in the first 3 months. Not the information, the trust. Here is something they don't tell you about invisibility. It's one of the most powerful positions in any building. Executives talk freely in the presence of cleaning staff, not because they're stupid, though some of them were, but because they have trained themselves over years of office life to categorize. The person in the maintenance uniform is filed under infrastructure, same mental category as the HVAC system and the carpet. Infrastructure does not listen. Infrastructure does not understand. Infrastructure is not a threat. They are wrong, of course. By week 3, I had started keeping a small notebook in the breast pocket of my uniform. Nothing dramatic. I wasn't a spy. I wasn't recording anything. I was simply writing down what I observed, the way Martin Keller had perhaps once taught me to observe, at a lunch when I was 15 and too nervous to eat. I observed that the 4th floor conference room was used every Tuesday at 7 p.m. for meetings that were not on the company's official calendar, attended by 3 specific executives, and occasionally by a man I did not recognize who arrived in a car with tinted windows and always left before 9. That the recycling bins in the executive suite on floor 42 regularly contained printed documents that had been crumpled but not shredded, a compliance failure that struck me as sloppy for a company of this size. That the financial operations department on floor 19 worked unusual hours, lights on past midnight several times a week, a pattern that didn't match the legitimate deal flow timelines I understood from my coursework. That the glass elevators, which I cleaned at specific intervals, carried conversations through their close quarters with remarkable fidelity to the ears of someone wiping down the panels at a careful, unhurried pace. I was not yet understanding what I was seeing. I was only cataloging, building a picture from fragments. Then I began carefully uncrumpling the documents. The first document that stopped me was a memo, internal, stamped with a department code I'd memorized by this point, discussing something called Project Redline. The language was heavily abbreviated and clearly assumed significant context on the part of the reader, but 2 things were clear. It involved a series of equity transfers across what appeared to be a chain of subsidiary entities, and there was a timeline. The timeline compressed dramatically around what was labeled Q4 target acquisition. I smoothed it out, photographed it with my phone, replaced it. Over the following weeks, I found more. Not all of it was comprehensible in isolation, but I had been studying finance for a year and a half. I had the textbooks, the coursework, the frameworks. What I lacked was the specific institutional knowledge, the internal shorthand, the entity names, the relationship maps. So I built those, piece by piece from what I gathered. I photographed financial schedules. I noted subsidiary names. I cross-referenced what I could with public filings using my phone during breaks. There was a woman, I'll call her Paige Carter, who worked in financial operations on floor 19. Late 30s, careful manner, always the last one out of the department. I had been cleaning her floor for 6 weeks when she noticed me. Not the way most people notice maintenance staff, the quick, unseen glance that slides off. She actually looked at me, once. Then, a week later, again. The second time she said, "You're always here late." "So are you," I said. She considered this. "What time do you get off?" 2. "That's a long day." "It's a long building," I said, and went back to work. 3 nights later, she was still at her desk at midnight. I was resetting the conference room next to her open office door. I heard her exhale. Not a sigh exactly, more like someone releasing pressure that had been accumulating for a long time. She said, not quite to me, not quite to herself, "These numbers don't make sense." I kept working. "I've run them 6 times, she said. 6 different ways. They don't make sense." "What kind of sense don't they make?" I asked. I didn't look up. A pause. "The kind where something is moving that shouldn't be moving." I looked up then. She was watching me with an expression that was calculating something. "I took finance courses," I said. "Before this." "Did you?" Not a question. "If you wanted another set of eyes on something that doesn't make sense," I said. "I come back through here at 12:40. She didn't say anything. I finished resetting the conference room and moved on. At 12:40, when I came back through floor 19, there was a printed spreadsheet on the corner of her desk, angled slightly outward. She was not in the room. The spreadsheet sat there like a quiet invitation. I photographed it, added it to the growing archive on my phone. She was at her desk the following Tuesday when I came through. She didn't look up. On the corner of the desk was another document. This was how it went for 2 months. We never discussed it directly. We never acknowledged it explicitly. She left things where I would find them. I added them to what I was building. It was a collaboration conducted entirely in the grammar of plausible deniability, which meant it was safe for both of us. What she had found, and what I was slowly, painstakingly beginning to understand, was a mechanism, a financial mechanism that had been running in various forms for at least 12 years. It involved Monroe Industries and a network of subsidiary entities, some of which were real companies and some of which were, based on the filings I could cross-reference, essentially empty shells. Capital moved between them in patterns that looked, from any single vantage point, like normal corporate activity. But from above, from the pattern level, it was something else. It was predatory positioning. The acquisition of leverage over smaller companies through a sequence of steps. First, becoming involved in their financing at a moment of vulnerability, then quietly acquiring their key debt instruments through intermediary entities, then at a strategically selected moment, accelerating terms or restructuring agreements in ways that created crises the smaller company couldn't survive. The target company either sold under duress or collapsed. Monroe Industries or its affiliates absorbed the assets. This had happened, based on what I was piecing together, at least 7 times, and I was looking at evidence that it was happening again. The current target had a name in the documents. When I finally decoded the internal shorthand, when I matched the entity descriptions to public records, when I confirmed what I was seeing with a cross-reference I ran at 2 in the morning in the parking structure behind the building, I sat in my car for a long time with my hands on the steering wheel. The current target was my father's company. Think about that for a second. The same machine that had destroyed my grandfather's partnership, the same mechanism, the same actors, the same methodology, was now positioning itself around the company my father had spent his life building. And my father didn't know, couldn't have known. From where he sat, Monroe Industries was simply a well-capitalized neighbor whose owner happened to be his business partner. If you were in my position at that moment, sitting in that parking structure, holding this information, what would you have done? Drop it in the comments. Seriously, I want to know. I went to see Howard Pierce, not about the estate, about the past. I sat across from him in his quiet office, and I asked him what he knew about Martin Keller's relationship with Monroe Industries. I watched his face as I asked. He knew something. He was careful about what he said, but he was not entirely evasive. I think because he had been waiting for someone to ask him this for a long time. Martin Keller had been his client for 21 years. He had watched the man build his estate in careful, systematic silence. He had watched him sever connections, one by one, from people he'd loved. He had watched him become, publicly, the eccentric recluse that my father dismissed. In 1998, Pierce told me, your grandfather entered a significant joint venture with a company that would later become Monroe Industries under its current leadership. The venture was in commercial real estate development. It was your grandfather's largest single investment at that point. He paused, chose his next words with the precision of someone who had been a lawyer for a long time. The venture was restructured under circumstances that your grandfather always believed were not accidental. He lost approximately 60% of his capital in that partnership. He spent 3 years in litigation and reached a confidential settlement. Pierce looked at his desk. He told me once that the settlement was the worst decision he ever made. He said he'd traded the truth for the money. Why did he cut off contact with our family? I asked. Pierce was quiet for a moment. He believed, and based on the materials he left in my care, I believe he had reason to believe, that Monroe Industries had studied him carefully during the partnership, that they had used that period of access to understand his vulnerabilities, including his family relationships. He felt that if he maintained visible ties to his family, they would become leverage. He cut us off to protect us, I said. That is how he characterized it to me, yes. I sat with this. I thought about a man I'd met 6 times, who'd sent cash and birthday cards, who'd asked a 15-year-old boy what he noticed when he walked into a room. The condition, I said, the year at Monroe, he knew what I would find. Pierce was careful again. He believed you would find something worth finding. He chose the timing based on specific information he had about the company's current positioning. He had been monitoring them for years. A pause. He also believed that a year of working in that building, in that role, would teach you things that no classroom could. He was very specific about that. He could have just told me. He could have, Pierce agreed. But then you wouldn't have found it yourself, and he felt that the manner of discovery mattered significantly for what came after. Pierce met my eyes. He understood that what you would need to do with the information required a particular kind of credibility, not inherited certainty, hard-won knowledge. I left his office and sat in my car for a long time. Then I drove to the apartment, opened my laptop, and began organizing everything I had into something that could be presented to people who needed to be persuaded. I need to tell you about the thing I did wrong, because this story isn't about someone who was flawless. I made a serious mistake, and it nearly ended everything. It was in February, month 4 of my time at Monroe. I had assembled a significant amount of documentation. I had the memo photographs, the spreadsheet materials, the publics, filing cross-references, the entity map I'd built over months of careful work. It was substantial, but not yet sufficient. I needed the deeper transaction records, the ones that would show the actual capital flows, rather than just the surface patterns. I had found a server room on floor 11 that the maintenance team accessed for cleaning. It was a legitimate access point. I had keycard clearance for the floor. The actual servers were in a locked cage, but the monitoring terminal was not. And one night, late, when the floor was empty, I made a decision I should not have made. I sat down at the terminal. I'm not going to pretend I had a sophisticated plan. I had coursework knowledge and a YouTube video worth of understanding about network architecture. I got approximately 4 minutes into an attempt to navigate the system before an alert triggered somewhere. Someone was notified, and a security officer arrived on the floor 8 minutes later. The security officer found me. Floor. Everything okay up here? He floor. Everything okay up here? He asked. Slow night, I said. Gets quiet on 11. He nodded. He left. For 3 days, I waited to be called into an office and questioned. I was certain a log existed of whatever I'd triggered. I was certain someone with more access than me would pull that log and trace it to my keycard. Nothing happened. Either the alert had been a false positive and was filed as such, or someone with access to the log had not prioritized investigating a maintenance worker on floor 11 at 1 in the morning. I would never know which. But I sat with the knowledge of what I'd done for a long time afterward. I had risked everything, the year, the documentation, the entire project, on an impulse, a shortcut. The kind of shortcut that people take when they are starting to feel the pressure of time. I never attempted anything like it again. I returned to the slow work, the patient work, the work that couldn't be challenged. That mistake taught me something essential: the difference between information that will hold up and information that won't. Everything I had gathered through observation and Paige Carter's carefully positioned documents was defensible. I had found things that were accessible in the normal course of my work, and I had documented them appropriately. Anything I'd obtained through unauthorized access would have been not only inadmissible, but catastrophic. I recommitted to the patient method, and paradoxically, the fear of having nearly lost it all made me more thorough, more careful, more systematic than I would have been otherwise. 3 weeks later, Paige Carter left a document on the corner of her desk that contained the transaction chain I had been missing, internal to the company, produced as part of a routine audit summary, misfiled in a way that made it technically accessible to her department. She had noticed it, pulled it, and placed it where I would find it. I don't know if she fully understood what she was doing or what I was building. I think she understood enough. I think she was someone who had seen something wrong for a long time and had been waiting for someone to appear who would do something about it. I added the transaction chain to the archive. Now I had enough. I should tell you about the day Bradley Monroe saw me in the lobby. It was a Friday afternoon in late January, month 3. He came through the lobby on his way to the elevator bank, flanked by 2 people. He was visiting his father's company, which he did periodically with the easy ownership of someone who has always understood that all of this will eventually be his. He stopped. I was wiping down the reception desk surface, unhurried, methodical, the way I had learned to do the work properly. I saw him before he saw me, which gave me approximately 3 seconds to decide how to hold my face. He saw me. The recognition took a moment. I watched it travel through him, the slight adjustment, the double take, the reorientation of context. Then the smile arrived. Not the sharp, calculated smile from the commons. This was something warmer, more satisfied. The smile of a man who has just been handed confirmation of a worldview. "No," he said. He laughed. Not cruelly, which was somehow worse. Genuinely, delightedly. "No, you're working here as a..." He gestured at the uniform. "Maintenance," I said. "So you dropped out." He shook his head slowly. "I heard something about your grandfather, some family thing. I'm sorry about that." He didn't sound sorry. "But here, come on. This is where you ended up?" He looked around the lobby, the marble floors, the elevations he had grown up regarding as his natural inheritance. "I guess some people find their level eventually." I looked at him. I thought about everything that was sitting in encrypted folders on 2 separate devices. I thought about the transaction chain Paige Carter had handed me the previous Tuesday. I thought about the board meeting, 8 months away. "You might be right," I said. He laughed again, that warm, satisfied laugh, and walked to the elevator. I went back to the desk surface. I thought, not yet. Here is what the estate looked like when I finally gained access to the full picture. Martin Keller had spent 26 years rebuilding after the Monroe partnership destroyed 60% of his capital. He had done it slowly, systematically, without spectacle. He had moved into sectors that were unglamorous and therefore undervalued. He had taken positions that required patience rather than timing. He had diversified across enough categories that no single loss could be fatal, and he had kept enough liquid that when opportunity materialized, he could move quickly. The liquid capital, the decisive moment reserves that Howard Pierce had mentioned, was substantial, more than I had imagined, enough to execute what I was beginning to plan if I was careful and precise about how I used it. I also had something else, the estate's existing equity positions. Martin Keller had, over the previous 18 months, apparently anticipating that someone would eventually be in a position to use them, quietly acquired small positions in several entities connected to Monroe Industries. Not enough to draw attention, not enough to require disclosure in any public filing, but enough to form the nucleus of something larger. I spent month 7, the month after I had assembled the complete documentation, in a detailed private conversation with a financial attorney Howard Pierce had recommended. Not about the documentation yet, about capital markets, about acquisition mechanics, about the specific rules governing disclosure thresholds, shareholder voting rights, and the timing of board-level challenges. I learned that to force a vote at the annual shareholder meeting, which was 11 months away, I needed to achieve a specific percentage of outstanding shares. That percentage was not impossible to reach. It was achievable with the liquid capital if I was disciplined about execution. The challenge was secrecy. Any large, rapid accumulation of shares would be visible and would trigger immediate defensive responses from the company. I needed to accumulate slowly through intermediaries in ways that didn't flag the pattern. This required lawyers, specialized ones. It required financial intermediaries who were both competent and discreet. It required a level of institutional navigation that I could not do alone. So I built a small team, carefully. Each person was told only what they needed to know. The attorney managed the legal structure. A financial intermediary I found through a reference chain from Howard Pierce managed the market operations. A third person, a forensic accountant, the financial attorney recommended, began reviewing and formally certifying the documentation I had assembled. I was 21 years old, working nights as a janitor and running a covert financial operation out of the apartment I rented for $800 a month. Let me describe what the days actually looked like, because I think this matters. I would wake at 9 in the morning after sleeping 5 or 6 hours. The first hour was for physical maintenance, running, which I had started doing partly for the discipline, and partly because it was the one time of day that my brain would quiet down enough to let things settle. 3 miles, 4, occasionally more when the anxiety was particularly active. Running doesn't solve problems, but it imposes a kind of physical honesty that office work and screen work don't. You either run the miles or you don't. There's no arguing with the distance. From 10 to 2, I worked on the documentation and the financial strategy. This was the desk work, cross-referencing, building the entity maps, corresponding with the attorney and the financial intermediary through encrypted channels, working through the share accumulation tracking in spreadsheets I maintained with a rigor that would have surprised my former professors. I had become, through necessity, a much more precise analyst than my coursework had produced. When your own money and your own future and the safety of your family are the stakes, you stop cutting corners on the verification. Every figure had 3 checks. Every entity name had independent sourcing. Every transaction had its chain documented fully. From 2 to 4, I tried to exist like a normal 21-year-old for 2 hours. I ate, I read. I occasionally called people, former classmates, a couple of friends who had known me before the leave of absence, and were baffled by what I was doing, which I could not explain. I maintained these relationships imperfectly and with less energy than they deserved, but I maintained them. I had seen what isolation did to people who operated alone for too long. Martin Keller had been alone for 26 years. I understood at some level what that cost. I was not willing to pay all of it. From 5 p.m. onward, the building. This was the rhythm for 11 months. I won't pretend it wasn't frightening. It was. There were weeks where I woke at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark cataloging everything that could go wrong, that could be challenged, contested, reversed, detected. There were weeks where I questioned whether Martin Keller had miscalculated, had overestimated me, had trusted the wrong person. But the work was concrete. When you focus on the next step, the next document, the next share accumulation, the next verification, the fear becomes background noise rather than the foreground. This is the thing they don't tell you about strategic action. It's not courage, it's specificity. When you know exactly what the next step is, the fear of the entire project becomes manageable because the project isn't the problem. The next step is the problem, and the next step is always survivable. I need to tell you about Anthony. I had expected Anthony to be angry. I had expected him to argue, to contest, to lobby my parents against me. That was what a direct response to losing an inheritance looked like, and Anthony had always been a direct response kind of person, when direct response served his interests. What I hadn't sufficiently accounted for was Anthony's willingness to take a longer view when the direct route was blocked. In month 5, Howard Pierce called me. "I've received correspondence," he said, "from a law firm claiming to represent a claimant to the estate. The claim is based on a document purporting to be an addendum to your grandfather's will, signed 4 months before his death, dividing the estate equally among surviving grandchildren." I was quiet for a moment. "That document doesn't exist." "No," Pierce said, "it does not. We have the complete documentation of every revision to Mr. Keller's will over the last 15 years, and there is no such addendum. The document they've submitted is—" A pause. "Forensic examination will be required, but my initial assessment is that it's not authentic." "It's a forgery," I said. "That appears to be the case." "My brother—" "I can't speculate on source, but the law firm has been asked to preserve all records of how the document was obtained and produced." Pierce's voice was very careful. "The matter has been referred to appropriate authorities for examination." Anthony had taken the long view. He had decided that if he couldn't inherit legitimately, he would manufacture legitimacy. He had found a document preparer, or perhaps done it himself. Anthony was capable of that level of initiative when sufficiently motivated, and produced a fraudulent addendum. It was the kind of decision that makes sense to someone who has always operated at the margin of honest behavior, who has calibrated the risks of small improprieties for so long that larger improprieties start to look like a simple matter of scale. He was wrong about the scale. I did not call him. I did not contact my parents about it. I noted it, filed it, continued. The legal referral would process at its own pace. I didn't need to manage it. It was managing itself. Meanwhile, at home, my parents were doing their own version of managing. My mother had shifted, I gathered from occasional second-hand accounts, from anger to a more complicated grief, the grief of someone who is beginning to suspect that the narrative she has been living in is not the one that was actually happening. My father, I was told, had become quieter. His business was showing stress fractures that he was aware of and didn't fully understand. His operating credit had been restructured by one of his lenders, restructured in a way that I now recognized from the documentation I'd spent months studying as a preliminary tightening. He didn't know that the restructuring wasn't random market conditions. He didn't know that his lender's decision had been influenced by quiet pressure from an entity connected to Monroe Industries. He didn't know that he was being positioned. He was 3 months from a crisis he couldn't see. I was 7 months from a board meeting. The timing was going to be close. In month 9, Paige Carter quit. She came in on a Monday morning, met briefly with her department head, and was gone by noon. She was thorough. She left nothing on her desk, nothing in her drawer. Her workspace was clean and empty within an hour of the meeting ending. I found out about it from the maintenance chief, who mentioned it casually that evening. Finance department, one of the senior analysts gone. Going to be a lot of extra foot traffic up there for the next few weeks, interviewing. I didn't react, but I understood what it meant. Either she had been pushed out because someone had noticed what she was doing, the documents left in the corner of her desk, the quiet collaboration that had been happening for months, or she had made a decision to remove herself before a connection could be drawn. I hoped it was the latter. I thought it was the latter. Paige Carter was not a careless person. I sent her nothing. I did not attempt to contact her. Any contact would have created a thread that neither of us needed. If she had chosen to disappear cleanly, my reaching out would have undone the very thing she was protecting. I did, however, add a note to the documentation archive. A careful, factual account of how the documents had been obtained, framed in terms of their physical accessibility to authorized personnel. I did this for her protection. If the documentation ever came under challenge, the narrative of its origin needed to be unimpeachable. She had taken a risk for reasons I could only partially understand. Whatever she had seen in those numbers had been troubling enough that she'd chosen to help a janitor she barely knew rather than remain silent. I respected that more than I could have said to anyone at the time. I hoped, wherever she had gone, that she was safe. Month 10 arrived, and I began the process of separating from Monroe Industries. Not abruptly, I served out my remaining time with the same steadiness I had maintained throughout. The maintenance chief would later say, to someone who asked, that I'd been one of the more reliable evening crew members he'd had. I noted that with a kind of satisfaction I hadn't expected. On the last day, a Friday in October, almost exactly 1 year after the day I'd first arrived in the lobby in my gray uniform, I handed in my keycard at the front desk. The security officer who processed it didn't look up. I walked out through the lobby, past the marble floors I'd mopped countless times, through the revolving door into the cold morning air. I sat in my car. I thought about the man who had put me here, about his calculation, that the manner of discovery mattered, that what came after required a particular kind of knowledge that couldn't be borrowed or inherited or handed to you across a lawyer's desk. It had to be earned in the specific, physical, unglamorous way that Martin Keller had always understood things were earned. I drove home. I called Howard Pierce. "I've completed the employment term," I said. "I have the documentation." "I'll prepare the transfer," he said. Full control of the estate transferred to me 12 days later. 48 hours after that, I authorized the financial intermediary to complete the final tranche of share acquisitions. When the transaction settled, I controlled 11.3% of Monroe Industries' outstanding shares, accumulated over 9 months through 14 separate intermediaries, in blocks small enough to avoid disclosure requirements individually, significant enough in aggregate to matter decisively. The annual shareholder meeting was 6 weeks away. I want to be honest with you about what the 6 weeks before the meeting felt like. It felt like weight. Not excitement, not triumph, weight. The weight of a thing that has been in process for a very long time and is now close enough to completion that the stakes become absolutely real in a way they somehow weren't before. I worked with the attorney and the forensic accountant to assemble the presentation. Not just the documentation. Documentation alone was insufficient. The documentation had to be contextualized, sequenced, explained in terms that a board of directors, a room full of shareholders, and eventually a regulatory body could follow without specialized knowledge. It had to be airtight. It had to anticipate every challenge. We also formally submitted a regulatory filing. This was critical. I didn't want to walk into the meeting as the only authority on what I was presenting. I wanted the documentation to have already entered an external review process, so that what I presented in the meeting was corroborated by ongoing official examination. The regulatory submission was filed 21 days before the meeting. I told no one in my family what was happening. Not my parents, not Anthony. I had my reasons. Partly operational security. The fewer people who knew, the fewer threads that could fray. But partly something harder to name. I was not ready yet for them to be part of this. Whatever happened in that room, had to happen without the weight of their needs and expectations distorting it. I needed to be in there alone, without performing for anyone's benefit, without carrying anyone else's relief or grief or vindication as cargo. I would tell them after, in my own time, in my own way. I bought a suit, not an expensive one. I wasn't making a statement about wealth. A well-fitted dark suit, a clean shirt, a simple tie, appropriate for a boardroom, appropriate for a person who belongs in, was scheduled in the company's main auditorium, a space I had cleaned many times, though from a different angle than the one I would occupy today. It had a stage at one end, a long curved table for the board, tiered seating for shareholders and their representatives. I was registered as a shareholder. My attendance was legally guaranteed. I arrived early and sat in the third row. I had a folder on my lap. I was composed in the way that people are composed when they have done too much preparation to be anything else. The anxiety had burned through. What was left was something colder and more precise. The board filed in. Edward Monroe, Bradley's father, was at the center, as always. He was older than I remembered him from the occasions I'd seen him at family functions years ago. Heavier, more deliberate in his movements, but carrying the same fundamental authority. A man who had spent 50 years understanding that every room he entered was his room. He sat down. He looked out over the assembled shareholders with the easy comfort of someone who has never had reason to be nervous in a room like this. Then he saw me. He didn't recognize me immediately. I wasn't in a gray uniform. I wasn't holding a mop. I was wearing a dark suit and sitting in the third row with a folder on my lap. And whatever I was in that moment, I was not what I had been in his lobby. The recognition came slowly. I watched it arrive. He looked away, returned to his papers. But I had seen it. The small recalibration, the brief settling of something uncertain. The meeting opened. Standard agenda, financial reports, operational updates. I sat through it, patient, specific. When the floor opened for shareholder comments and concerns, I stood up. The protocol required me to approach the podium. I walked to it, set my folder on the surface, and looked out. At the room, at the board, at the assembled shareholders, at the lawyers in the side rows. Bradley Monroe was in the room. He was seated off to the side, not at the board table. He wasn't a board member, just an observer by family right. I found him in the seating and then looked away from him. Not yet. "My name," I said, "is Martin Keller's grandson." I let that land. I watched Edward Monroe go still. "I currently hold 11.3% of the outstanding shares of Monroe Industries," I said. "I am also the representative of 2 additional shareholders who have authorized me to act on their behalf today, which brings the voting position I speak for to 18.1%. The room was absolutely quiet. "I have documentation," I said, "of a systematic financial manipulation mechanism that has been operated through this company and its affiliated entities for at minimum 12 years. This documentation has been formally submitted to the relevant regulatory authority. The submission was made 21 days ago, and I have a reference number available to anyone who wishes to verify the status of the filing." I opened the folder. I'm going to walk through the structure of what was done. I'm going to name the entities involved. I'm going to show the transaction chains. And I am going to explain how this mechanism was used, how it was used against my grandfather 26 years ago, and how it is being used right now against a smaller logistics company whose owner has no knowledge that he is the current target. I looked at Edward Monroe. He was gray, not red, not angry, gray. The color I had pictured in the parking structure 11 months ago when I first understood what I was holding. I began. "I will not give you every detail of what was said in that room, because the record of it is now part of regulatory filings that are a matter of public record, and because what happened in the mechanics is less important than what happened in the room. What happened in the room. 3 board members requested an immediate recess within the first 20 minutes of the presentation. The recess was denied. I had the voting position to deny it. The presentation continued. A lawyer for the company raised evidentiary objections at 4 separate points. Each objection was addressed in the documentation I had prepared, which had been specifically constructed to anticipate them. The forensic accountant, who was present in the room and whom I had introduced at the outset, responded to the technical challenges. At the 90-minute mark, 2 board members publicly stated they had not been aware of the mechanisms being described and called for an immediate independent investigation. This was significant. It split the board in real time. At the 2-hour mark, the chair of the audit committee, a woman I had never met, whom I understood only as an independent director, requested a 30-minute recess. In the recess, she made a phone call. When she returned, she made a formal statement that the audit committee would be opening a formal review immediately and that she was recommending, pending that review, that certain executive authorities be suspended. Edward Monroe said nothing during the recess. He sat at the table with his lawyers on either side of him, and he was very, very quiet. The meeting was not the end. Meetings never are. What happens in a meeting becomes the structure within which the real events unfold over the following days and weeks. The regulatory processes, the legal proceedings, the internal investigations. But the meeting was the moment at which the structure shifted irreversibly. You cannot unring that bell. Once those board members had publicly stated what they'd said, once the audit chair had made her recommendation, once the regulatory submission had been entered into the record, the trajectory was fixed. Companies can survive scandals. They can manage press. They can settle with regulators. But what they cannot survive is the internal fracture of the people who were supposed to be protecting the structure, discovering publicly that the structure was being used against them. Once the board fractured, the executive cohesion that had maintained the mechanism for 12 years was gone. And without that cohesion, the people who had been aware, who had been complicit or at minimum willfully blind, began to make the calculations that people in that position always eventually make. 3 executives resigned within the following 2 weeks. Edward Monroe resigned from the board the following month. The regulatory process, which I had correctly anticipated would take time, proceeded with the documentation I had provided as its evidentiary foundation, and my father's company, whose financing had been quietly squeezed by Monroe-affiliated entities, found, in the months following the meeting, that the pressure had eased. The entity holding his restructured credit was itself under regulatory scrutiny and was not in a position to continue its predatory positioning. He would not know why for some time. But the immediate threat receded. That was what mattered. I need to tell you about the moment with Bradley, because it was not what I had imagined. I had imagined, in the months of preparation, some kind of confrontation, some moment of clear reversal, him understanding what I had done, me watching it register, the kind of scene that the movies have trained us to want. What happened was smaller and truer. After the meeting broke up, after the board had moved into closed session and the lawyers had coalesced into intense, private clusters, I found myself in the atrium outside the auditorium, the same atrium where I had, for 12 months, moved with a cleaning cart at midnight. Bradley was there. Standing alone, his usual constellation of approving faces was, for once, absent. He was on his phone, but he wasn't. At me for a long time. I watched him go at me for a long time. I watched him go through something. I don't know exactly what. The arithmetic of it, maybe. The full dimensions of how comprehensively he had misjudged what was standing in front of him, all those years, in all those rooms. He didn't say anything, neither did I. He looked away first. I walked to the elevator. I pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The executive floor, which I now had access to as a significant shareholder with legal business to conduct. I rode up in the glass elevator, the same elevator I had cleaned 1,000 times. I stood in the top floor office and looked down at the lobby. It was exactly as I'd seen it every night for a year. The marble floors, the reception desk, the revolving door. It looked smaller from up here, not in a triumphant way, just smaller, like a thing you've grown past. I called my mother that evening. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been waiting. "Something happened today," I said, "with Monroe Industries. I need to talk to you and Dad, both of you, not on the phone." Silence then. "Are you all right?" "I'm all right," I said. I drove to the house that evening, the house I'd grown up in, the house with the careful appearances and the hidden strains and the weight of a name being maintained. My father was in the kitchen. He looked older than I remembered. He looked tired. He was trying, I realized, in the way he held himself at the table, in the careful set of his face, to maintain a dignity he was no longer certain he deserved. I sat down. I told them, not everything, the essential architecture, Martin Keller's history with Monroe Industries, what had been done to the partnership in 1998, why he had pulled away, the condition in the will, the year in the building, what I had found, what I had built, what had happened today. My mother cried, not the careful, managed tears from the lawyer's office, real ones. My father was quiet for a very long time after I stopped talking. He sat at his kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface, and he was quiet, and I let him be quiet. "He chose you," my father said finally. Not accusatory, just understanding something. "He chose someone who would finish it," I said. "I don't know if that means he thought I was exceptional. I think it means he thought I would actually do it." "Your grandfather never trusted me," my father said. "He didn't trust the situation," I said. "He knew what they'd do if they saw the connection. He was protecting you by staying away." My father nodded. He was absorbing something very large, a man who had resented an absence for decades, learning, all at once, that the absence had been a form of love. I thought, there are things that cost too much to explain in real time. You have to do them first and explain after. About Anthony, I said only that there had been a legal matter involving the estate that was being resolved through appropriate channels. My mother closed her eyes briefly. My father said nothing. I didn't stay long. I had a meeting in the morning with the financial intermediary and the attorney, and I needed to sleep, and I had learned, over the past year, that some conversations needed to be short, that the full weight of a thing doesn't process better with more words. Sometimes you deliver the information and let the other person carry it at whatever pace they can manage. At the door, my mother held my arm for a moment. "Are you okay?" she asked, different from the first time she'd asked it, on the phone. This time she was asking about something deeper than logistics. I thought about it. "I'll tell you when I know," I said. 3 months after the shareholder meeting, Bradley Monroe called me, not from a number I recognized. I had changed my number once since the meeting for practical reasons, but from a number I traced quickly enough. It rang twice while I was looking at the screen deciding whether to answer it. I didn't. He left a voicemail. His voice was measured, controlled, doing its best to sound casual. "Hey, it's Bradley. I don't know if this is the right number. I just wanted to talk. I think there are some things worth discussing, maybe some mutual interests going forward. Give me a call." I listened to the voicemail once, then I deleted it. He called again 4 days later. I did not answer. He sent an email, my professional contact address, which was publicly available. A week after that, it was longer and more honest. He acknowledged that the previous year had been difficult. He said he hoped I understood that what his father had done was his father's business, not his. He used the word unfortunate several times. He suggested that men of our generation had opportunities to build differently, to where they belong. I did not reply, 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 not reply to where they belong. I did not reply, not because of hatred. I want to be clear about this. I hadn't done any of what I'd done out of hatred. Hatred would have required me to keep him central to the project, and the project had been about something larger than him, from the moment I understood what Martin Keller had actually left me. But there are people you outgrow, and people you choose to keep in your life, and Bradley Monroe was not someone I chose, not out of cruelty, simply because there was nothing there. The gap between what he understood and what I now knew was too vast to serve as a foundation for anything. You cannot build a relationship, even a business relationship, on the rubble of what he had said and what I had done. The architecture doesn't support it. I closed the email. I opened a new window and returned to the work I had been doing before it arrived. It's been over a year now since the shareholder meeting. Enough time to see what the landscape looks like from here. The regulatory process is ongoing. These things move slowly, by design, and the full accounting of what Monroe Industries' executive team did over 12 years will not be complete for some time. I have been cooperative with the investigation, and I will continue to be. The mechanism has been disrupted regardless of how long the formal process takes. The companies it was targeting have had time to reposition. The predatory pipeline has stopped. I think about Paige Carter sometimes. I don't know where she went. I haven't looked because looking would create exactly the kind of thread that I committed to not creating. But I think about what it must have cost her, whatever it cost her, to leave those documents on the corner of her desk week after week for a maintenance worker she barely knew. She had seen something wrong for a long time. She had waited for someone to appear who would do something about it. When I appeared, improbably, in a gray uniform, asking careful questions at 12:40 in the morning, she had made a decision. I hope the decision served her. I believe it was the right one. I have no way to tell her that, and I've made peace with not being able to. Some things you do in the dark for reasons that may never be visible to anyone, and the rightness of them is not confirmed by acknowledgement. It's confirmed by what happens afterward in the world, in ways you may not be positioned to see. She did the right thing. I know that. I carry it. My father's business has stabilized. Slowly, carefully, with restructuring assistance from financial counsel, I found him through my now expanded network. He is not thriving, that is too strong a word, but he is not collapsing. He is learning, at 61 years old, to run a business without the hidden pressure of a predatory entity quietly tightening the screws. This is, I have come to understand, its own kind of victory. Not dramatic, not visible, but real. There is a conversation I had with him 4 months after the shareholder meeting that I keep returning to. We were sitting in his kitchen, the same table, and he was asking me about the estate, about the financial structures, about how to think about what I'd inherited. He was asking in the specific way that proud men ask for guidance from people younger than them, carefully, technically, keeping the emotional register manageable. At one point, he stopped mid-question and said, "I didn't make it easy for you." "No," I agreed. "The pressure we put on you, the grades, the appearances." He looked at his hands on the table. "I thought that was how it worked, that if you were excellent enough in the ways that were visible, the rest would follow." I thought about what to say. I thought about a man I'd met 6 times who'd understood something different, that the work that matters is usually not the work that's visible. "He knew you'd be that way," I said. "My grandfather, he wasn't angry about it, he just accounted for it." My father nodded slowly, absorbing, processing. "He sounds like he was a difficult man to know," he said. "Yes," I said. "I think so. I think most people who understand something clearly are difficult to know, because they're not performing the understanding, they're just operating from it. And that's disorienting to the people around them." My father was quiet for a long time after that. I've thought about that conversation many times since, about what it means to understand something clearly, about whether I do yet, or whether I'm still in the early stages of learning what Martin Keller spent 26 years working out. Anthony was formally charged in connection with the estate forgery. He was not charged with anything catastrophic. The forgery had been intercepted before it could be acted upon, but the charge was real, the legal consequences were real, and the claim he had hoped to establish was permanently extinguished. He and I have not spoken. I have not sought that conversation, and I don't expect to. Some estrangements aren't dramatic ruptures. They're just the recognition that the thread connecting 2 people is thinner than either of them knew, and both parties are honest enough to stop pretending otherwise. I went back to university last fall. Different program. I transferred credits, adjusted my focus, started fresh in some ways, and built on what I had in others. I sit in different rooms now than I used to, not because of the money. I am careful about what the money does and doesn't change, but because of what the year taught me about how rooms work. I know who's watching. I know what people's silences mean. I know what gets left in the margins. In my first week back on campus, I sat in a lecture hall for an advanced financial theory seminar. The professor was excellent, rigorous, clear, demanding. Halfway through the lecture, he used an example from a real-world case study. The case study involved a corporate entity using affiliate structures to exert predatory financial pressure on smaller competitors. I recognized the methodology immediately. I had lived inside it for a year. I had documented it across hundreds of pages and presented it to regulators who were still processing it. The professor explained the mechanism in 20 minutes. I had spent months understanding it from the inside, in a gray uniform at midnight, with photographs taken on a phone in my breast pocket. I didn't say anything in the lecture. I took notes. I asked a question at the end, a narrow, technical question about disclosure timing, that made the professor pause before answering. He gave me a look that meant, "That's more specific than a student usually gets." Afterward, a classmate asked me where I'd heard about that angle. "Work," I said. "Some days I feel the weight of what I know as an isolation. I'm in a room with people my age who are learning the language that I have, over the past year, been forced to learn in the original. There is a gap that I don't know how to close, and I am not sure I want to. The gap is also, in some measure, a protection. I know what I know how I know it, and I am still, even now, careful about who I tell. Some days it feels like an asset. Some days it feels like a kind of loneliness that I can't fully explain. The loneliness of having seen too much of how things actually operate underneath the way they present themselves. Of knowing the maintenance corridor behind every polished lobby. Martin Keller was alone for 26 years. He built the estate in quiet, patient, unglamorous work, and he watched the people he loved from a careful distance, and he held the shape of what he was building in his mind without anyone to tell it to. I understand that better now. I understand what it costs to play a long game, not in dramatic terms, in the ordinary, daily terms of who you become while you're doing it, what calcifies, what you lose access to in yourself when you've been strategic for long enough. I'm 22 years old, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with that. The morning after the shareholder meeting, before the calls, before the formal proceedings, before any of the aftermath had begun, I drove to the estate, the house outside the city that I had inherited and not yet visited. It was large, set back from the road, surrounded by trees that had been growing there for 30 years without anyone managing them into a particular shape. The interior was exactly what you'd expect of a man who had money and no interest in spending it on signal. Spare, clean, functional, books on plain shelves, a kitchen that had been used, furniture that had been selected for durability rather than impression. In his study on the desk, there was an envelope with my name on it. Howard Pierce hadn't mentioned it. I don't know how long it had been there, whether Martin Keller had placed it there weeks before he died, or years. I stood in the study for a moment before I opened it. Inside was a single page. His handwriting was even and clear. A man who had written things by hand his whole life, when everyone around him had stopped. It said, "I don't know you as well as I would have liked." That's a failure of the situation, not a lack of interest on my part. I've watched you from a distance for years, longer than you know, and what I've seen has been enough. The condition in the will is not a test of character. You already have the character. It's preparation for a specific task. The task will become clear when you've done the work. I believe you will do the work. Don't celebrate when it's over. You'll understand why when you get there. The house is yours. Use it however serves you. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket. I stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the trees. The trees had been growing in their own shapes for 30 years, unhurried, indifferent to whether anyone found them impressive. I thought about what the inheritance truly meant, not the money, not the position, the understanding that had been passed to me across the gap of years and distance and chosen silence, that the work that matters is always slower and less visible than the work people applaud, that what looks like coldness is sometimes the most sustained form of love available, that patience is not passivity, that invisibility is not weakness, that you can spend a year in a gray uniform, mopping marble floors at midnight, and be building something that the people who walk past you cannot yet see. The morning light came through the windows, and the trees held their own shape outside, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt for the first time in a long time like I knew exactly who I was. I wasn't sure yet whether I liked him, but I knew him, and that, I was starting to understand, was where everything real had to begin. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment. What would you have done in that first moment in the lawyer's office when the condition was read? Would you have accepted it? And at what point would you have walked away from the whole thing, if ever? I read every comment.